do do, funky fantasy, do 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 do, and the bowl, do 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 do, Stratoceros, do 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 do. It's the War of Nerds. And you're probably hearing that introduction and wondering why we did that and made your ears bleed, but I assure you something better will be to come. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the first ever episode of the War of Nerds podcast. I am one of your hosts, Nathan Helm.
I'm your other host, Alfred Muller.
And I'm Ryan Morgan.
And together we are the Warriors 3. No, I'm just kidding. Today we have a pretty exciting episode. We're giving all of you the chance to get to know us, who we are, what inspired us to get into writing, why we became nerds, and just all the things we love on that side of things, as well as we're going to go into categories of writing and what classifies genres as what they are, as well as a new genre that the three of us are doing our best to pioneer. So with that being said, we are going to start with Alfred. So go ahead and take it away.
So I'm Alfred Muller. I'm the author of the Water Crystal series. It's got 2 books out right now. The third one should be out early 2025. And I'm working on a young adult book, and I've got a slew of other projects I'd like to get done. But I am an independent author, and that all started with stories my mom would tell me as a kid off the top of her head. She would just come up with stories instead of reading me books. She would just tell me stories to get me to go to sleep. And then my dad would play G.I. Joes with me and create stories and craft ideas and plots and everything. And together they kind of developed a love for storytelling, which I kind of abandoned for a while just because I hated reading. I hated that kind of stuff. And it wasn't until I was in 12th grade when I started to actually enjoy writing and reading full time. Like just it consumed my thoughts. But little things like the original Dracula with Bela Lugosi, the original Wolfman with Lon Chaney Jr., those kind of stories, movies really inspired my love for the fantastical rather than like mundane or just like I guess they would call literary fiction rather than fantasy fiction or sci-fi fiction. And then other movies like Star Wars and Star Trek and Indiana Jones, they all kind of continued to push me in the nerdery direction. And then I found comics, I found anime, I found superhero movies and all that. So it's kind of been a journey from there, but it all started with my parents kind of building up that creativity in me.
Absolutely. And as I'm sure as growing up with those things, did you ever see yourself becoming a writer when you were a little kid? Like, was that something that just came into your mind? Like, yeah, I'm going to become a writer.
It never even crossed my mind. It wasn't even until I started reading that I was like, huh, I could do this. Because like I had a dozen different things I wanted to be, from a professional athlete to a scientist to a police officer to in the military and all that kind of stuff. And then I'm sitting there in my high school and they're like, all right, you got to start thinking about what you want to do when you grow up. And I was like, ooh, I could do this.
That's awesome. It's funny how the paths, we think we might take in life end up, we either end up doing it, but then we differ later on and end up doing something that was maybe just a passion, having creative minds as the three of us do. There's a lot of different outlets you can take, but that's simply fantastic. Now,
I agree.
Mr. Ryan Morgan, how about you take the floor, sir?
Alrighty, Ryan Morgan, that's me. I write under the pen name Stratos Eros. I'm working currently on my first series, Magi of Danu. It's an urban fantasy about magic guilds and controlling how magic is controlled in the world and the people fighting against that system and tearing down the archaic ways. I had a lot of influences growing up, mostly movies, TV shows, and comics that got me into writing. When I used to try to read, it was Hardy Boys books because I inherited them from my father. And then the Dragonlance Chronicles were huge for me when I was a kid, but I could hardly ever finish them. I'd start a book and I'd be like, this is where I want it to go. It's not going there. And then I'd grab a piece of paper start typing on a computer, trying to change the story. And that's kind of where writing took over for me. Is I wanted to tell the stories, I wanted to create the stories rather than read them. So as far as reading goes, I'm not as well read as most authors, but I think my creative mind has always been geared towards telling the stories. So that's kind of where I got into it. And movies and comic books, stuff like that. Star Wars was a huge thing for me. Lord of the Rings, I love that. A lot of sci-fi. I started off with a lot of that early on. But yeah, just it bounces all over the place. Anime, superhero comic books, Green Lantern, X-Men, obviously, all that stuff growing up, just huge plethora of genres that I fall into, which kind of go into our conversation later of where some of those all fit.
Absolutely. And did you, as I asked Alfred as well, did you see yourself when you were younger? Did you think that you were going to become a writer, or did you think you would just always have a creative mind and perhaps go into screenwriting or some type of creative making YouTube videos, or just, did you ever think that you would become what you are now?
I always wanted to pursue it as a hobby. I always wanted to be a writer, but I never thought it would be the path I would take. I always saw it as like a secondary thing, which currently right now it still is. But I was a huge history buff, so I actually wanted to be a museum curator, and that's what I originally went to school for. But complete life pivot and went in a completely different direction on that as well. But I'm still really love history, so eventually I'd like to build that back into some of what I write, but mine's mostly just fantasy right now.
That's simply fantastic, and I believe we're going to have to do an episode later down the road about history curators and some of the movies that have fallen into similar genres like National Treasure, Night at the Museum, um, and,
Absolutely.
and and things that correlate to historical fiction and things like that, because it's simply, I find it fascinating.
Mhm.
Um,
It's funny you say that
so
too, because
that's
I his museum curator was one of those many, many things I wanted to do and had a list. So that's cool.
Yeah.
and it's funny too when you hear the word history museum curator. I only think of the curator from Ready Player One, and I don't know why, but it just either that or Robin Williams as a little tiny Teddy Roosevelt in Night at the Museum, and I just was, rest in peace to his soul, but
Oh,
that's simply
absolutely.
fantastic. Well, I
So
suppose
with
that
that being
leaves
said,
me then.
Yes.
yes, it does.
Well, hello everyone. I'm the Doctor. I do not have a companion with me currently because she's on the TARDIS. No, I'm kidding. So my name's Nathan Helm. Also, um, coin nickname the Funky Fantasy Man. I am a writer of fantasy, sci-fi, lit RPG, and military. And currently, I have a series called Kingdom Society that has two published books, but I'm actually going through the process of rewriting both of them to make them extended and add some more things to the world, um, to give my readers that those juicy treats and that juicy lore. Um, so I'll be working on that. It's going to be a 6 book series all in total. There's 3 separate series within the Kingdom Society universe. You've got, I kind of went the Star Wars route, was starting in the middle, and then I will go to the prequel trilogy called The Dawn of Magic, and then I will go to the future trilogy, which takes place 1,000 years after Kingdom Society, called Future Kingdoms, which will be even heavier science fantasy than what Kingdom Society is. So, anyways, when I was a kid, I grew up in church, so I grew up with a musical background, and I spent a lot of time there just because of being a kid, and that's where I spent most of my time. And we had this huge library full of books, just books of all nature. Most of them were pretty much specifically targeted towards Christian fiction and things like that. But we had other books that kind of went out of that. But, Chronicles of Narnia, a lot of C.S. Lewis books were there, and I would read the ones at least that I was allowed to read. And when I got a little bit older, I read C.S. Lewis, The Screwtape Letters, which that one is they'll put the fear of God in you. But anyways, on a side note, there was a lot of other books too at the library. There was some Tom Clancy, some Star Wars, Our church was like okay with like some fantasy stuff. Lord of the Rings was there too, but like those were all the stuff from church. But we had pretty much all of those books at home, anyways, too. So at my dad's, I spent most of my time reading because if I wanted to watch a movie, this was something really cool my dad did with me when I was a kid. If I wanted to watch the movie, I had to read the book first. So therefore, it really not only built my interest for books more and for universes, but I got to watch the movie with my dad and have that experience too as a kid. So that was really cool. Lord of the Rings was like the first one that he made me read the books for to watch the movies after. And yeah, I plowed through the trilogy in about a week and a half. And I told him, I'm just like, okay, I'm ready to watch the movies. So we watched the movies, and then I had to do that with books. So that was one thing that drew me to nerddom. I loved comic books. My dad had a lot of old comic books too, and I think he still has them. They're somewhere. They're somewhere in storage, and I kind of want to go back and like show him the comic books I have now and see if he still has any of his old ones and like compare them because I've got like a #1 edition Hawkman comic still in packaging. I refuse to take it out because it's the gold plated Hawkman edition. It's super cool. So anyways, comic books, I'd go out with my friends when I was a kid and play like fake lightsaber duels and shoot laser beams and do stuff that I remember going to the theaters and watching The Adventures of Shark Boy and Lava Girl. And that was like when Taylor Lautner was like a child. This was way before the horrible Twilight movies. So did I say
I
that
wonder if
out
those
loud?
books were
Sorry,
even read.
folks.
I wonder if those books were even written back then.
They were, unfortunately. When I was in middle school, but you know, the older I got in school, literature was a really big thing. I had awesome English teachers that we would read The Outsiders, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, a lot of Mark Twain, Huckleberry Finn, you know, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, whatever, like all of the classic literary adventures. We would watch movies too that kind of fell into the same category. Titanic, Mel Gibson's The Patriot, the version where the heads don't get chopped off, the non-R-rated edition. I watched the R-rated edition with my dad. And so I loved war movies when we got to watch that in history and literature. So all the while, I'm in school and I'm building this like just nerdy creative brain. I'm already somebody who gets made fun of because I'm a music geek. So I just take full advantage of that. I'm like, you know, I'm going to screw around and write a story. So I write this little 50-page on paper and pencil called The War Under the Sea. And I thought it was the coolest thing ever. I was like, this guy's a marine biologist. His brother went missing when he was a kid. And then it starts where he's an adult and he's been a marine biologist and he goes in his like advanced super techno submarine boat craft that goes underwater and finds just like these man fish like hybrids that are like shooting guns and like crazy war stuff happening under. That's as much as I remember, but I gave up on it because kids being kids and being nasty told me it sucked. So it's somewhere. Maybe it still exists. I don't know. I'd have to ask my mom and see if she has it anywhere. So anyways, and then when I got older into high school and stuff, I focused more so on music, but I never thought I was going to be a writer, really, truth be told. I was always more on the theatrical side, doing voices, things like that. And I was just like, I really want to be a narrator. I moved to Florida. I did some small films, and I was trying to work my way into the voice industry. It was the easiest way to narrate an audiobook is to write my own book. So I got back into the creative field of writing with Kingdom Society, never for the express reason of like really developing the world. Like I developed it, sure. It was fun. But I was like, this will be my resume start for being a narrator. But then I really got into the writing and people actually liked the story. I was just like, well, I can't let them down. So here we are today. And I'm in writing, and that's like how I got there. It was a very, very non-traditional, kind of wonky way of getting there. But now I have like two passions, one of them being something I never would have thought. So I've always been creative. I've always been nerdy, but that was just kind of how I ended up. Simply fantastic.
Those kids were idiots, but because War Under the Sea is an epic story title, so I don't care what they say. I would read that book just on the title alone.
Absolutely.
perhaps I'll dig back into my subconscious and I'll relive those manuscript pages that I wrote with a regular pencil and paper, and I'll go back and remember those days. I mean, I still remember it. You never forget your first story, no matter what age you wrote it at. Um, and in school, we were heavily focused upon like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, The Outsiders, a lot of old school books like that, a lot of Mark Twain. And those were big, heavy parts of literature in our school. Um, so classics play a role, and I think it's good to never forget them.
My I had a fourth grade teacher, and he read us "Where the Red Fern Grows" and "Castle in the Attic." "Where the Red Fern Grows" is just a good old uh, tale of a boy and his dogs. "Castle in the Attic" was the closest thing to fantasy I had read at that point, where guy goes into an attic, has a little castle, and he shrinks down, kind of like Indian in the Cupboard style, where then he can go in and be with the knights and everybody in the castle. And it was just like this is cool. Uh, Even though like at the time I didn't like reading myself, but when someone would read me a book, I was enthralled with the story. And
Yeah,
then going to church when I was a kid, that kind of influenced why I write about angels and demons. Just because I like that gritty war aspect that you never really get in church. And I was like, I want to know about that. So if no one's going to tell me, I'll just create it.
100%.
Absolutely.
And it's we talked a little bit on our TikTok live the other day about reenactments and retellings of things that haven't been touched on as much, especially dating to historical fiction and like retellings of, for example, the Titanic, or maybe retelling of King Arthur and the Round Table. Or I think another really interesting one that could be retold is like, don't take World War One or World War Two because those have been done over and over again, but take something like the Cold War or the Vietnam era and do a retelling of where the troops are in the jungles of the Viet Cong, and instead of Vietnamese soldiers, they're getting taken over by zombies because some crazy mad scientist turned all of the locals into flesh-eating freaking demon possessed zombies or whatever. Um,
That could be cool.
and instead of coming back with Agent Orange, they came back with zombie infection and started infecting other continents until you had an entire world full of zombies and everybody dies.
And
I
see
think
that.
that's the. Go
Sorry,
ahead.
go ahead, Ryan. No, you're good.
I was just gonna say, I think that's the cool thing about our scope as authors and fantasy specifically is you could take real world things and you can twist it into this fantastical world just by switching one simple detail, like Nathan said there, with adding the zombies to that war, or things from the past with like the Lost Legion. Why were they lost? Just twisting that story to make it well beyond what the truth is and just give it a wider scope there.
Yeah, yeah, retellings are great. I think Nathan, you had said something last night that like certain classics like Lord of the Rings should never be remade. Like they're perfect the way they are for what they are, and it's just one of those things where leave that one alone. But historical items or like public domain items where you want to do a retelling, I feel like that's all in good taste and in great homages to those great stories or historical truths.
I agree. And I think there's some things when it comes to old school that you can retell that are considered stories, Aladdin, maybe some princes and kings and um, things that old school Disney um, did back in the day, The Lion King, or things that are similar to that are considered folklore or fairy tales. And doing like dark retellings of those can be really fun, whether you're using the same characters or not. Doctor Who did an episode of that actually, with kind of a bit of a retelling of Robin Hood, which was completely brilliant. Um, I don't know if you remember, it was a Peter Capaldi era episode. Um, if you remember that or not.
I don't know if I saw that one.
Yeah, Robin of
I
Locksley.
I have not, but I definitely want to now because Robin Hood is a love that series. Like any creation of those just has me hooked already.
Yep.
and that's a prime example of a story that I think could be retold in a different way.
Mm.
It's because they've been done so many times. It's something that is kind of just creative freedom. But where you have old school classics like Murder on the Orient Express by Agatha Christie, or Huckleberry Finn by Mark Twain, or Lord of the Rings by Tolkien, or even The Hobbit. Like if anyone dare touches The Hobbit, like, which was written back in the 1940s, like you can't touch stuff like that. Those are meant to be what they are. Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, The Outsiders, like Where the Red Fern Grows, The Green Mile. Those are all books that shouldn't be touched because of what they are. They're like national treasures.
They hold up till today,
Uh,
where I think retellings are a good way to make certain stories fresh for a newer generation. But a lot of the stories you mentioned still hold true. They still have elements that are relatable to even now.
100%. 100%. Well, now that you all know who we are, we're going to take a quick 5-second break. This episode is brought to you by nothing because we're not sponsored. So you don't have to worry about commercial breaks. On to the next section. So we're going to get into genre. I hope y'all don't mind, but we have some raunchy slapstick comedy in here, and it's just our jam. Um, so we're going to get into genres and the categories of genres and subgenres and how you classify and break them down, where some of the arguments come in about what is what, and about our um, anime genre that we are going to be pushing forward and pioneering. Even with all the hate, even with all the backlash, we're still going to do it because it is for the readers. It's not for the salt mongers out there. So with that being said, we're going to start off with the genre of fantasy and everything that falls under it. Ryan, if you'd like to start us off, go ahead.
Uh, sure. In general, fantasy, putting me on the spot here, but I think there's a lot of genres that do fall under it. We've talked about this before in the past with Star Wars, whether it's sci-fi, whether it's fantasy, and knowing that they split into quite a few different crossovers there. And I was actually listening to a different podcast the other day, and they had Richard Lee Byers on there, who's an author. They were interviewing him, and he had a really good tidbit about how genres break down. You have a pie chart. The genre itself is the full pie chart, and then you break down fantasy into all these little pieces. And the smaller the piece gets, the smaller your audience gets. But now that we start crossing over these different genres, that pie piece gets bigger and bigger when you mix horror, fantasy together, you mix romantic and fantasy, you get romantasy, and that covers a wider genre of that pie. And I think that's what we're going to get into with the anime thing is there's an untapped part of that genre where we write similar to other parts of fantasy, but it's different enough and has some tropes that anime brings in that we can really push into that. So if you have a list of fantasy you want to talk about, let me know.
Absolutely. I mean, when I think, you go on to Amazon per se, and you look at all of the fantasy selections that it gives you. Well, you've got metaphysical, you've got alternate world, which I mean technically falls under science fiction, but it can still be referenced to fantasy as well, especially portal fantasy. You've got grimdark, you've got dark fantasy, romantasy, you've got horror fantasy, which falls into the grimdark category usually. And all these other little things, low fantasy, high fantasy, traditional fantasy, which is more considered towards Arthurian fantasy, King Arthur, the Round Table, et cetera, which not a lot of people, write in that type of fantasy anymore. Historical fantasy. And you've got all these different things that fantasy is a pool of a bunch of different love and creations that fall under one broad scope. Fantasy just means fantastical beasts, huge mind-bending magics, different physics, different worlds. And not always. You've got low fantasy like Harry Potter, which takes place in the real world, but it's hidden from normal everyday people, or urban fantasy like Jim Butcher's The Dresden Files. There's a lot of different things that fall into fantasy, but I think honestly it can be whatever you want it to be. Reimagining a genre is not a bad thing. It is just
Mhm.
somebody has to think of it. You're never going to have it until somebody thinks it up. And it may go against the norms, it may can be considered taboo to some, but once they experience it for what it is, and they have an appreciation for it. And that's I think that's fantasy in a nutshell. I mean, in my opinion. I think
For
there's a
me,
lot of there's a lot of leverage for creativity, a lot of areas for creative differences and whatnot. But
for me,
Alfred, what say you?
for me, when I think of fantasy, I think of like multiple races or different species, and then I think magic of some sort, and then uh, grand adventure, uh, some type of epic scale. Which I know there's like shorter fantasy that you could easily get. You don't have to go on the epic scale, but that's kind of what I think. I think multiple races. I think magic, and then I think some form of adventure-esque style.
Yeah, I think that's a big thing. I mean, if you want to talk about quest fantasy, Lord of the Rings would be a prime example of what quest fantasy would fall under. You have one quest, getting the one ring to Mount Doom to destroy it is the quest that the entire series is driven by. That is the entire plot of what Lord of the Rings is getting the Frodo and Sam getting that ring to Mount Doom to destroy it. But you have all the little things and adventures and lore and things that you learn about along the way that go into that major scope of what the story is. Um, so yeah, fantastical creatures, quests, adventure, large scope, battles, religions, um, just being creative and having your world have its own rules, I think is what makes fantasy fun.
And I think Ryan said something good earlier too, where it was like uh, now it's almost like fantasy still kind of gets a bad rap for being like the kiddie genre or the genre for less sophisticated individuals. And I do think it's gotten better in the last couple of years or last decade, but I still think there's that stigma where it's like that's not real fiction, it's just kid fiction. But like Ryan had said, I mean, that's the beauty of fantasy. You can take real world real world application and put it in fantasy or attribute fantastical elements to it, and you have a
Mhm.
relatable story that can touch the hearts and minds of millions, and it's in a way that you mask what you're really talking about, but presenting it in a fun, entertaining way that people can relate to and agree with.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. So I think that's our nutshell on fantasy. So to the next genre, which I believe is probably it used to be the second most popular, but I think it's kind of fallen off a little bit in the last few years due to entertainment and TV shows and movies dropping the ball, even video games such as Halo. Um, but science fiction slash space opera used to be known as it was probably more popular than fantasy, truth be told. Um,
Absolutely.
and really, in a nutshell, science fiction, I think what separates it from fantasy, what makes it so much different, is that everything about fantasy can fall into a science fiction. Because of being a larger universe, grand scale, you have the abilities to have all of those tropes from fantasy within a science fiction universe. But sci-fi focuses more on the nitty-gritty uh, tactics, mechanics, the science, weapons and technology, species even. I would say Star Wars would be a prime example. You learn about all these different species. You know, the Force, we know about the Force. It's the one magic part of Star Wars. B soft magic is what it is, but the Force is the magic part. You know, Jedi are basically space wizards. It's essentially what they are. But you've got all these different universes and planets. You've got a very political driven structure, the Empire, the Trade Federation, whatever you want to think about it. It's bounty hunters and rules and things that are very, very science fiction heavy. Dune is a prime example. Halo, the video game, or Star Trek: The Next Generation, Doctor Who, Farscape, Stargate Atlantis. I mean, the list goes on. But if you look at those You compare that to, say, Lord of the Rings, Highlander, Game of Thrones, Harry Potter. They're very different feeling things. But I think why Star Wars is so beloved as a science fantasy is because you get to have the love of magic and all of that, but you also get to have the nitty gritty. Even though things aren't really broken down about how lightsabers are constructed, it's like, you have a kyber crystal, you go to a Jedi temple, you have a little seance to figure out your inner self as a Jedi. The Force surrounds you. Yes, my stick's better than bacon. If you get that reference, anyways. So that's kind of my pitch on sci-fi space opera. Farscape, I think, is a great example of what space opera, why it was so great and why it was so beloved. Farscape was fantastic. But whoever would like to go next, Ryan or Alfred, go ahead.
I'll go ahead and jump in. I definitely think you hit something you hit the nail right on the head there with the science part. And I think that's the big differentiating force between fantasy and sci-fi, for me, at least, is sci-fi focuses more on the science. It may have the other elements that you mentioned of the fantasy, but I think they delve more into the science. Now, just like fantasy, you have soft magic, you have hard magic systems. In sci-fi, you have hard science, where people will go into the exact physics of how the spaceship moves in space. And then you have soft science, where the spaceship moves. That's all you need to know, is the spaceship moves. And it gets from point A to point B in this amount of time. Don't question it. And I think in Star Wars, we grew up, don't question it. We don't question it until they started giving us things to question, like the unfortunate midichlorians fiasco. But
we'll have a whole
why is the X-Wing hovering?
We will have so much to talk about in a Star Wars episode. It may be a two-parter.
or more.
We could do about 10 episodes worth of Star Wars. We'll blow your mind with some Star Wars theory. Why X-Wings hover, even though the engines are not technically on, or the difference between thruster engines and the hydraulics of the Death Star, or why the plans were so unbelievable that you would no, that man was a hero. Okay, Galen Erso put those plans together so that the Death Star could be destroyed. All right, but no, Star Wars is very soft science. It's soft magic, soft science. People are just like, oh, that's cool. A lightsaber can cut through titanium alloy, and we're not going to question it.
Nope.
And apparently Anakin's midichlorian count is higher than Master Yoda's, but we're not going to question it about how midichlorians make no sense whatsoever in the grand scheme of what the Force actually is.
True.
But Star Trek,
science
what's that, Alfred?
Science is the main crux of sci-fi, I think.
Yeah, 100%. So that's science fiction, space opera from our nutshelled point of view. Now it's, sometimes you may be listening to the podcast and be wondering, do they have a dogmatic view of some of these genres? Are they fulfilling their destinies? Oh, no. Well, that'll be for you to determine. We just hope that you enjoy it nonetheless.
And
coming up to the next
disagree with us, if they disagree with us, by all means, let us know in the comments. We'd love to talk about it. We can bring it up on future podcasts or TikTok lives. We want to engage. We want to talk. We love these things. We don't think we're like the end all be all of like, you must listen to us because we're right. But we like talking about it, and we're open to hearing other people's viewpoints. Because if you love this stuff as much as we do, I mean, there's no wrong answer really.
100%. It's the beauty of it all. Differing opinions. Some people love Star Wars, some people hate it. Some people love Star Trek, some people think Star Trek's better than Star Wars. They're completely wrong, but it is okay to have those opinions and to have those.
we might have to bring a guest on just to counter argument us on that, because I think we're all three leaning Star Wars on that.
Yeah. Unless we're talking about the next generation, because that's a generational classic that is simply Patrick Stewart's acting could have just driven the entire series by himself. So, I believe moving on to the next category, it is what's probably known as one of the more popular ones in today's age, and that would be lit RPG slash game lit books and audiobooks. So, what goes into that genre? I think it's pretty simple. Lit RPG, if you want an example from something that's been done in movies or anime, you've got Ready Player One, you've got Sword Art Online. Those are very lit RPGs, usually set in the future. Technology is at a high point. They've got some sort of virtual reality or a nanite or other way to put people inside of a video game where you play as a main MC and you get to level up quests, dexterity, constitution, mana, aura, strength, whatever. You're going through and leveling up like if you're playing Skyrim or The Legend of Zelda or anything that's considered D&D or what have you. So when it comes to
Yeah.
game lit RPG, it's pretty much what you're dealing with. So
I was gonna
that's
say
my opinion in a nutshell.
the Dritz series, the Dragonlance series, I think is at least loosely, even though it leans more fantasy. I know it's based off their D&D characters, uh, Tracy
Mhm.
Hickman, Margaret Weiss, their D&D characters. So I think that one's more fantasy, but it's very closely related. But Dritz is 100% lit RPG based solely off of the campaigns he's run and his character. And most of the stuff put out by Wizards of the Coast is probably going to be lit RPG.
Yeah, I think it a lot of it requires those rules. So even if you're in the fantasy setting, you're gaining health, you're leveling up, like Nathan said, and those specific game type mechanics play into the story, and it's like well known that you're inside of a game or that those things happen to you during the course of your adventure.
100%. Um, and like Alfred had mentioned, R.A. Salvatore's the Dark Elf series, The Legend of Drizzt. Um, that's very D&D. It was inspired by his D&D character, and it just went from there. So you can get quite creative when doing things like that. You come up with a character playing a board game, and you're like Jumanji. There's a game lit for you. It's an old school one, but it's very game lit. Or I'm trying to think of even older ones that have been done that are similar to that. Not coming across my mind right now, but there's plenty of lit RPG books out there done by indie authors, and there's one called Ascend Online by Luke Chmelenko, and this is where they inject nanites into the user's body, and when they're in their tank, when their mind is in the game, their body is continually being nourished, so they don't die in game from a lack of nourishment in the real world. Though they still do lose weight, so there still is slight consequences. Um, but it's really neat to do that. And I think lit RPG can be combined with just about really anything that you want to do. You just got to be creative with it and have your own rules. So um,
Mhm.
I think that's lit RPG game lit in a nutshell. So we'll move on to. There's not too many really genres out there that y'all haven't heard of, but I mean the remaining ones would be romance, mystery, action and adventure, military, and historical anything. Um,
I think for the most
prime
part, those are
examples
pretty self-explanatory. Like,
they are.
uh, I think that's the other funny part about like sci-fi and fantasy. They're so hard to nail down, even though I think we did a pretty good job about it. But there's still debates over what those are. But no one's sitting there being like, "Is that a mystery? I'm not sure. What really makes a mystery?" Uh, and then romance is just the same as mystery for me. It's the genre is the description of what you're looking for when you pick that book up.
Someone got murdered, bro, and we don't know who it is, but I'm still not sure if this is a murder mystery. Like, I get that, they're trying to figure this out and stuff, but really, I mean, people get murdered in all types of books. So, I mean, there's mystery around it. Like, no, it's a murder mystery. Okay. Like, you read a Tom Clancy novel, that's a military novel. Okay. If two people fall in love, and it's my least favorite genre out of any genre, which is the romance genre, because puke. Um, I'm just not interested in smut or romance, but to each their own. Some people really like to read about. He walked into the room. She was waiting for him. Heart thumping, pulse rising. He went to the one love of his life. 150 pages later, they still haven't sealed the deal. So, could do without
Have you
it.
guys seen those videos on TikTok where it's the guy or the girl and they're like, how women write male characters, how males write women characters, and it's just like he was a 30,000-year-old half elf, half dragon, half vampire, half human with 8-pack abs and all this stuff. I laugh at them all the time because it's like that's exactly what a romance novel is right there, like the most unrealistic super male you could think of is the main love interest who could do no wrong. He can cook, clean, and hold down a full-time job and never be upset or frustrated.
I
Yeah,
will I will defend it a little bit because I do like my share of romance mixed in with fantasy at times, but I do think the benefit to romance novels is they build a different type of tension than we would normally build in our fantasy, and they do that well.
Oh,
So
I'm a big old sap. I love
yeah,
I find like my guilty pleasure is a romance novel or some type of uh I have romance in my books. I do
mm,
enjoy a romantasy from now and from time to time. But yeah, I'm with you. It's a completely different tension that they build. Not to hate on the genre, like that
no,
it takes skill to still write there, but
yep,
it's funnier when you could look at those silly tropes that they do and think about it.
absolutely though, because they do stick to their tropes 100%.
yeah, super Chad bro, dude. Gets the damsel in distress who's a waitress at the local diner, and super Chad bro dude walks in like Jack Reacher. He walks, big old muscly dude. He's like, "Hey, my name's Chuck. What's yours?" "Oh, my name's Vanessa." It's always Vanessa or Chuck or Ryan or Shelby or some, common name like that. And he's like, "What time you get off work?" "I get off at 5. You want to go down to the park?" Um, okay. Said couple goes to park, falls in love under the stars, and no, it's like I like having characters that build love with each other. They get married or they become a couple within other stories, but just strictly a romance, unless it's like a rom-com. I do enjoy romantic comedies. I do find those entertaining. But yeah, no, romance in a nutshell, not one of my favorite genres. I'm not big into horror books either. But it doesn't mean that you haven't had some good ones. The Shining is a prime
Yeah,
example of a more of a thriller book, but it does have horror elements to it. Um, and but yeah, anyways, we could go on for that. But you were speaking about the male character and the female character being written.
yeah.
There's so much drama in the book world about men should not write female characters because they just don't do it right. Is that so? Well, then women shouldn't write male characters because they don't do it right either. Like, I mean, come on, y'all, give it a rest. Write what you want to write, write what you know, write what you don't know. Just have fun with it. If you want to write a female character, don't focus on her features per se, but focus on her as a human being. What's her personality? What drives her? Like, I don't need to know what her body measurements are to make her a cool female character. Same thing for a dude. I don't care how muscly he is or, he's, perfect everything. Like, what drives him? What are his personality traits? And that's what it really comes down to making a character of any gender is making the character relatable and not focusing on the mundane things that people really don't care about. So, anyways, we'll go to that on another day, but we've really wrapped
Absolutely.
up we've really wrapped up the hard genres when it comes to classification, and now we're going to come to you guys with our pioneer genre called anime lit, which refers to anime-inspired literature. Now, you hear this, and some of you may be yelling and in your car on your way to work or at the wall on the house and tossing objects near you that anime is not a genre. Well, it is. It maybe started off as, Japanese animation, um, but it is evolved into its own thing. And inside the genre of anime, you have a plethora of subgenres and different categories because what anime is it's explosive. It's larger than life. It's colorful. The emotional build of characters, that the way it's described, action scenes, power scaling beyond your wildest dreams, slapstick comedy, all of these things where you see the visual side in a manga or an anime. Being able to do that in a novel form, expressing that through writing is beautiful. And we want to be able to find our readers, somebody who loves mangas, somebody who loves animes, to know, oh, this author was inspired by Jujutsu Kaisen or Cowboy Bebop or Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, whatever it may be. And you see anime lit as the genre on Amazon, you're going to know it's for you. So that is how I describe it. Whoever would like to go next on their description.
Brian, you can go.
All right. So when Nathan and I first started talking about this, just between the two of us, I was 100% on board because I've had people read my book before, give me feedback, and 2 or 3 commenters in a row where this seems very anime-ish to me when they read it. And I'm like, oh, you know what? That probably makes sense because I like a lot of animes and a lot of the elements come into it. A lot of people will say, well, that's just fan fiction. You're writing an anime but changing the characters. And no, that's not it. I'm not writing about that character, but the elements of that story and those ideas, the over the top battles that we were talking about, the power scaling, those things, and you take them into fantasy, people want fantastic stories, but they want it to fit inside of a box that's realistic at the same time. Why did this happen when this guy's never had this power before? Well, he broke a limit. That's what anime is about. He broke that limit, that barrier that kept him from reaching that next level. And villains that are over the top, characters that kind of don't make sense at times, but then you fall in love with them despite how insane in concept they are. Like, these are the extravagant ideas that anime brings that we're shifting into novels where we can still write the same cinematic things you see from those pictures and the videos and bring it to life through word in a novel. And that's really what we want it to be. So, I mean, Alfred, whatever you got to add to that.
Yeah, when I think of like my own work, I think of trying to categorize, and like urban fantasy is the closest I can think of. But when you think of anime, there's so much good versus evil in anime in just a blatant way, and overcoming those limits, like you were talking about. One of the main things that I've noticed in a lot of anime is family and friendship, and the bonds that these characters build with one another, the emotions that you get from anime, from those relationships, and the characters just trying to be the best person they can be, or overcome some trauma that they dealt with, or something like that. But the emotions, the overcoming things, and the friendships and family that's formed in these shows that we love to watch and the manga we love to read. The only thing where I could see some people being like, "Oh no, that can't be a thing," is like you were saying, how it's a picture book compared to written word. But I don't think that's a problem. I think there's enough of us, our generation, maybe a few generations above us and a few below us, that have fallen in love with anime and do like to read and are looking for those types of stories that may not be out there. It's nice to read a historical fiction, but sometimes you want to add like, oh, why can't there just be a dragon or some magical thing that happens here? And you take the fantasy, why can't they just learn a new magical ability? Why does it have to be so structured? And Anime Lit can provide that.
100%. I mean, you think of animes and how they start, right? And people argue that the creator of Naruto, Kishimoto, or Oda from One Piece, or Akira Toriyama from Dragon Ball, they're like, well, they couldn't just do all this stuff at the beginning. They had to explain everything before it happened. Well, no, that's actually not a thing. You go back and watch any anime ever, you're seeing all this crazy stuff happen. Prime example, the first episode of Naruto, he's going and learning about a multi-shadow clone jutsu, a high Jonin level ability with some ancient scroll from the Hidden Leaf Village that miraculously was attacked by the nine-tailed fox when Naruto's parents were murdered. And you're like, wait, huh? What? What's shadow clone multi-clone jutsu? What? What's jutsu, bro? Like you find out about these things as the show goes, as these characters grow, new things that may pop up. A character is in a battle scene and the villain stops and he laughs and they have dialogue back and forth between one another, which may be unrealistic. But let's go and look at things that have been done. Star Wars has the most unrealistic dialogue ever created by a person, and people still love it. You need further proof? I don't like sand. That's the worst written line ever. You don't like it? Bro, nobody likes sand. Like, okay. So
It's so
One
coarse
Piece.
and rough, and it gets everywhere.
Yeah, don't forget about irritating too. Really irritating. Sheev Palpatine does 3 evil head turns in one conversation. Have you ever heard about Darth Plagueis the Wise? This dude
Well,
is telling you about an ancient Sith villain, and you're just looking at him like, nah, bro, can I learn this? Can I learn this ability? Not from a Jedi.
well, see, that's a great example of an anime style battle in Return of the Jedi. At the end, Sidious is sitting there talking, expanding upon his evil plan and what he wants to do, while Vader and Luke are fighting. And
Uh-huh.
that's very anime-esque, where the villain's like, "Oh no, you stink, you suck. I can best you at any time I want. You're not even trying. I don't even have to lift my pinky." Those kinds of things, and that's a very similar scene that you get. The only difference is instead of Vader being the one to talk with him, it's Sidious.
And to even add to what you said, that's a thing in the anime too. A villain will stop and a hero will be like, my next ability, you won't be able to stop. And the villain's just like, really? I don't believe you have anything in your arsenal that could defeat me. Go on. I'll stand here with my arms crossed and watch as you power up for the next 3 episodes. And, Kamehameha, 15 minutes later, ha! And Frieza's just over there, just like, stupid monkey, you have nothing that could defeat me. So that's the thing about it. The dialogue is goofy. These villains are maniacal, over the top, crazy, saying things that are just like, you're like telling us everything. Well, because that's what these villains are. They're confident, cocky, arrogant, and they're going to say what's on their mind because they don't believe anybody can stop them. And that's what's so fun about animes. When you're watching a fight, you're not sitting there and be like, yeah, that's believable. No, this girl's falling from a top level balcony while an entire fight's taking place, and then the girl still hasn't even come halfway down to the ground yet. Said fight is over, character goes down, but then the character almost hits the ground, and the character grabs it like, what? No, none of that is believable, but I'm here for it. I love it. So,
And and I think that's the huge thing about what we want with this genre is there's a group of people that say this is ridiculous and I don't want it, but that's not who our target audience is. We are reaching out and creating this genre for the people who want this, who want to see and read about these type of scenarios that are inspired from some of their favorite animes that they grew up and love. And that's what we want to put in our work.
Especially because you've got people who are reading the mangas and then watching the anime, or watching the anime and then reading the mangas. Why wouldn't they want something, maybe not a retelling or transferring that to a literature, but a novel style, but to know that there is another outlet that they can go to consume that kind of story they enjoy.
Absolutely.
100%. We on TikTok live last night, myself and Alfred had multiple people in the comments who were just like, bless you guys. Like, if I wish there was a genre out there like this, so I knew I could target what I want to read, because manga readers who love mangas like us and others, if we knew there was a novel form of that, even if it doesn't have pictures, like I'm going for it. I'm going to read that. That's
Yeah,
what whatever kind of anime lit book it is, fantasy, sci-fi, lit RPG, horror, supernatural. It doesn't matter. So
especially nowadays with Nathan, your area of expertise in audiobook narration. I mean, that's essentially listening to an anime without having the images in your face. Uh,
Hmm.
because I mean, I've fallen in love with narrators who just bring a story to life, and you're like, I could picture exactly what I saw in the movie, or if it's a based on a movie, or vice versa, or whatever, something like that. And I'm like, I'm listening to a cartoon or a live action show just without the images in my face. And if that can happen, then I don't see why anime lit can't do the reverse.
Hmm.
I agree. I've had people talk to me about my narrating on audiobooks and they felt like they were literally watching a movie in their head because I would cry when a character was at the point of crying. If they were gasping or coughing, it'd be like, "How dare you!" Like all of the aspects of what you hear in an anime, just like if they're screaming, then I'm screaming. I'll back my way away from the microphone and I will scream until I literally like my vocal cords are piercing. If a character is angry or if they're laughing or whatever it is, it says character bumbled with laughter or they cackled evilly. You have no ability to win, you poor failure. Like that's what you have to do in an audiobook to really draw people in to make them feel like these characters are alive. So on the narrating side of things, we'll have another episode where I'll get into that specifically with another
Hmm.
guest. But um, for tonight, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us on our first podcast episode of the War of Nerds. Um, right now, we'll leave you with our socials, and we'll see you on the next one. So for me, you can find me on TikTok or Facebook at author Nathan Helm or the Funky Fantasy Man.
For me, you can find me at stratuseros.com. All my socials are linked on that, or I'm most active on TikTok as author Stratus Eros.
For me, you can find me on TikTok at Alfred Muller 922 or on Facebook at Alfred Muller. On TikTok, I have a link tree there, so you can find all my other links there. I do want to say that we will probably be doing some TikTok lives in the future, so definitely go ahead and follow us on our TikToks because we'll post videos the day over a couple of days before to remind everybody because there'll be bonus content that you won't get on the regular podcasts on those because we'll probably stop the recording after we've done what we want to do, but stay on, answer questions, BS, all that good stuff. So there's more content if you enjoy listening to us that you can get there.
And for those of you who are maybe too wondering, is this appropriate for my kids to listen to? The language will be kept clean, with the occasional slip up of shit or something of that nature. But you won't have to worry about any harsh profanity or anything inappropriate. We're not going to go political or anything else on this podcast. It's simply for entertainment purposes and to have fun breaking down lore and books and movies and talking about the writing world. And we just want you guys to have fun and maybe learn something and maybe be inspired to start your own project, your own creative desires. Like everyone has a story. And I think it's whether or not you publish, getting those words on the paper can be healing for the soul. It can be a really neat experience. And, you know, God gave us all talents to use. And I think it's important to go be creative with our art, no matter what it is. So don't ever let anybody tell you that you can't do it or that it's not good enough. Just remember that finding your own audience is what's important. There's always going to be somebody who will love what you're writing. And that's why there's so many different genres. And that's why we do what we do. So y'all have been fantastic. Come find us on the flip side on the TikTok. But otherwise, funk fantasy, the bowl, Stratus arrows, it's the war of nerds.